We all know about Enigma and Bletchley Park. But what if the war was won by a different kind of signal? One Hitler knew about and chose to ignore. In 1941, American sailors were dying in the Atlantic. Their survival depended on knowing where the U-boats were. But the Allies had a secret weapon that Hitler himself tragically dismissed. Before the U.S. could crack Nazi codes, they had another way to track them. Simple electronics. Hitler's high command was warned, but their arrogance led to a fatal mistake. When most of us think about how the Allies won the Battle of the Atlantic, our minds go straight to one word: Enigma. We picture the brilliant minds at Bletchley Park, men and women like Alan Turing, huddled over complex machines, finally breaking the unbreakable Nazi code. And make no mistake, that story is absolutely true, and it was a monumental achievement, a turning point that shortened the war by, some experts say, at least 2 years. We've all seen the movies, we've read the books. It's the story of brilliant decryption, of cracking the enemy's most secret messages. But there is a problem with that story. It's not the whole story. In fact, it misses a piece of the puzzle that is so large, so fundamental, that without it, cracking Enigma might not have been enough. Today we're talking about the intel before the decryption, the electronic aids that Hitler and his high command knew about, were warned about, and which they dismissed with an arrogance that would cost them everything. This is the story of the other signals war, the one fought not with codes, but with physics. The main weapon in this fight was a piece of technology known by a simple, almost comical name: Huff-Duff. It stands for High-Frequency Direction Finding, or HFDF, and its story is, in many ways, even more critical than Enigma's, especially in the dark days of 1941 and 1942, before the codebreakers truly got the upper hand. You see, the problem for the Allies was staggering. The Atlantic Ocean is a vast, empty, brutal wilderness, 3,000 miles of cold, gray water. Through this wilderness ran the lifeline of Great Britain. Convoys of slow-moving merchant ships packed with food, with fuel, with tanks, with bombs, and with men crawled from Halifax and New York to Liverpool and Murmansk. And hunting them was the most terrifying predator of the Second World War: the U-boat. In the early years of the war, the U-boats were winning. They hunted in wolfpacks, groups of submarines commanded by the brilliant and ruthless Admiral Karl Donitz. Their strategy was brutally effective. A U-boat would spot a convoy, fall back, and then use its radio to call in the rest of the pack. They would coordinate their attack, striking at night, on the surface, where they were faster and harder to see than the merchant ships themselves. The result was a slaughter. Ships went to the bottom in flames. Thousands of sailors, both British and later American, drowned in the freezing dark. Britain was being strangled, slowly and surely. The convoys were blind. Their escorts, the few destroyers and corvettes they had, were dashing about in the dark, trying to find a needle in a 3,000-mile haystack. And the U-boats? They were invisible. Or so they thought. This is where Huff-Duff enters the picture. The concept itself was not new. Direction finding had been around since the First World War. The idea is simple triangulation. If you have 2 radio receivers in 2 different locations, and both of them get a signal from the same transmitter, you can draw a line from each of your receivers in the direction the signal came from. Where those 2 lines cross, well, that's where your transmitter is. The Germans knew this. They used this. Their own signals intelligence, the B-Dienst, was masterful at using direction finding against British ships. So Donitz and his command felt secure. They believed that direction finding took time. They thought you had to transmit for a minute, maybe more, for the enemy to get a good lock on your position. Therefore, U-boat captains were under strict orders to keep their radio messages incredibly short. A quick burst of code, just a few seconds, to report a sighting or to confirm an order. To them, it felt as safe as a whisper in a hurricane. But this is where Allied ingenuity and Nazi arrogance collided. The British, and later the Americans, developed a new kind of Huff-Duff. The old systems required a technician to manually rotate a large antenna, listening with headphones for the signal to get strongest or weakest. It was slow, it was clumsy, and it took time. The new system, pioneered by the British and perfected with American manufacturing, was different. It used a brand new invention, the cathode ray tube. That's the same technology that powered old television sets, that green glowing screen.
This new Huff-Duff was instantaneous. The very second a U-boat captain keyed his mic, even for a 3-second burst, a green line would appear on the operator's screen, instantly showing the bearing to that U-boat. There was no spinning antenna, no listening for a faint signal. Just an instant, visual, unmistakable line. The Allies began installing these new HFDF sets, not just on shore, but on the convoy escort ships themselves. The hunter, quite suddenly, was being hunted. And the most chilling part? The U-boat crews had no idea. They would surface, send their quick, safe message, and submerge, feeling secure. But above them, a British corvette or an American destroyer had just seen that green line. They would turn, steaming at full speed down that bearing, their ASDIC, their sonar, pinging into the depths. The U-boat captain's first sign that anything was wrong would be the terrifying ping, ping, ping of the sonar locking on, followed by the thunderous crash of depth charges exploding around his hull. This shift was monumental. Before, escorts were purely defensive, a shield trying to bat away torpedoes. Now, with Huff-Duff, they were offensive hunters. Every U-boat radio was a beacon, a betrayal, painting a target on its own back. We dig into stories like this, the ones left out of the main history books, every week. If this is the kind of detail you appreciate, taking a moment to click subscribe really does help us keep this history alive for the next generation. It's a small click, but it truly does support this work. Now, when the United States entered the war in December of 1941, things got even worse before they got better. Donitz launched Operation Drumbeat. He sent his U-boats right to the American coastline, from Maine down to Florida and into the Gulf of Mexico. The Americans were, tragically, completely unprepared. They didn't have blackouts. They didn't have a convoy system. Merchant ships sailed, alone, brightly lit, silhouetted against the lights of cities like Miami and Atlantic City. For the U-boat commanders, it was, as they called it, the second happy time. It was a turkey shoot. Hundreds of ships were sunk, many within sight of land. The beaches of North Carolina were black with oil and debris. But the U.S. Navy, reeling from Pearl Harbor, but full of resources, learned fast. They adopted the convoy system, they implemented blackouts, and crucially, they began mass-producing and installing the new cathode ray Huff-Duff sets on their brand-new destroyer escorts. By mid-1942, the tide was beginning to turn. The hunters who had feasted off the American coast were now finding themselves in a fight for their lives. The question, the $20 million question, is why? Why did the Germans, so meticulous, so technologically advanced in many ways, allow this to happen? They had to know. Their own men were vanishing. Their top aces, the heroes of the Reich, were failing to return from patrol. Surely someone must have suspected that their invincible U-boats were being tracked. And the truth is, they did. This is where the story moves from the cold Atlantic to the halls of power in Berlin, and to the mind of Hitler himself. The German Signals Intelligence Service, the B-Dienst, was, as we mentioned, excellent. They were professional, capable, and they were very, very good at their jobs. And they were getting worried. They started hearing reports from U-boat crews who survived an attack. These survivors spoke of Allied escorts, seemingly coming out of nowhere, in bad weather, at night with uncanny accuracy. It didn't feel like luck. It felt like they knew. The B-Dienst began to raise the alarm. They issued warnings to Admiral Donitz's headquarters. They suggested that the Allies must have developed a new high-speed direction-finding system. They warned that the short signals were perhaps not safe. So what happened to these warnings? They landed on the desk of Admiral Donitz. Now, Donitz was a U-boat man through and through. He had commanded one in the First World War. He had built the new U-boat arm from scratch. He was a brilliant tactician, and he micromanaged his wolfpacks. That was his strategy. Direct, personal control from his command bunker in Lorient. But that strategy required constant radio communication. He needed his captains to report. To get those reports, he had to believe the radio was safe. His entire operational doctrine depended on it. So, when his own intel officers presented him with evidence that the radio was not safe, he was faced with an impossible choice. He could either accept that his entire strategy was flawed and that his men were being sent to their deaths, or he could dismiss the intelligence.
He chose to dismiss it. Donitz and his staff developed a terrible case of cognitive dissonance. They simply could not or would not believe that the Allies could have developed a technology that was that much better than their own. German superiority was an article of faith. They convinced themselves the losses must be coming from something else. It must be spies. It must be traitors inside their own bases in France. It must be that the British had a new, undetectable airborne radar. This last one became a fixation. The Germans developed a receiver called the METOX, a crude little wooden box with a cross-shaped antenna that was designed to listen for Allied radar signals. If it buzzed, the U-boat would crash dive. But here's the terrible, fatal irony. The Huff-Duff system was passive. It didn't transmit anything. It just listened. The METOX receiver was completely deaf to it. A U-boat could be floating on the surface, its METOX receiver silent, feeling perfectly safe, while an Allied destroyer 2 miles away was staring at a bright green line on its Huff-Duff screen, pointing right at them. The German High Command was looking for the wrong thing. They were so obsessed with Allied radar that they completely missed the threat of direction finding. And this wasn't just Donitz. These reports, these concerns, they made their way up the chain of command. They were seen by Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, a man famously incompetent and jealous of the Navy. They were seen by the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command. And they were seen by Hitler. This is the core of the matter. What happened when this vital electronic intelligence reached Hitler? He dismissed it. Why? Because by 1942, and certainly by 1943, Adolf Hitler had stopped listening to intelligence that he didn't like. He had come to believe in his own willpower and intuition above all else. He had been a corporal in the First World War, and he carried with him a deep suspicion of the aristocratic, highly educated generals and admirals of his staff. But he was also deeply insecure about his own lack of technical education. This insecurity manifested as baffling arrogance. He would overrule engineers on tank design. He would overrule generals on battlefield tactics. And he absolutely overruled his signals intelligence officers. Hitler was obsessed with wonder weapons, with offensive technology. He poured billions of Reichsmarks into the V-2 rocket, into the May 262 jet fighter, into gigantic, impractical tanks. The idea of defensive electronic warfare, of countermeasures, of just being smarter about signals, it bored him. It seemed trivial. It was beneath his notice. When his experts told him the Allies had a technical edge, he didn't see a problem to be solved. He saw a failure of will, or worse, treason. He and his inner circle preferred to believe their own propaganda. German science was the best in the world. German soldiers were the best in the world. Therefore, any losses must be the result of treachery, not Allied superiority. This created a feedback loop from hell. The more U-boats that were sunk by Allied escorts using Huff-Duff, the more confused Donitz became. His wolfpacks were failing. His attacks were being broken up before they could even form. His response? He needed more control. He demanded more radio reports from his captains. Where are you? What do you see? Why aren't you attacking? And his loyal, brave captains, obeying orders, would surface, key their mics, and broadcast their own death warrants. The more they talked, the more they died. The more they died, the more donuts demanded they talk. This cycle reached its horrifying climax in a single month, May 1943. History calls it Black May. In that 1 month, the Allies, now fully equipped with shipborne Huff-Duff, long-range aircraft, and crack hunter-killer escort groups, turned the Atlantic into a graveyard for the Kriegsmarine. Donuts sent 118 U-boats into the North Atlantic. The Allies sunk 41 of them. More than a third of his entire frontline force gone in 30 days. Thousands of experienced sailors were lost. It was a catastrophe from which the U-boat arm never ever recovered. On May 24, 1943, a shattered Admiral Donitz, who had only recently been promoted to Grand Admiral of the entire German Navy, wrote in his war diary, "The losses in May have reached an intolerable level. The U-boat war has, for the time being, ceased to be effective. We have been forced to withdraw from the North Atlantic. The enemy has won." They had won, and they had won in large part because Hitler and his admirals had dismissed a piece of electronic intelligence, a pre-decryption aid that was screaming the truth at them for over a year. They simply chose not to listen. But the story doesn't end with Huff-Duff. That was perhaps the most dramatic example, but this dismissal of electronic intel was a pattern. It was a sickness in the Nazi command structure. And it showed up in another even more famous battle, the Battle of Britain.
Before the first American soldier ever fired a shot in Europe, the British stood alone against the Luftwaffe. And again, the popular story is one of bravery, of the few in their Spitfires and Hurricanes rising to meet the German bombers, and that is all true. But they had a secret helper. It was called Chain Home. Chain Home was the world's first integrated air defense radar system. It was, by later standards, incredibly crude. The transmitters were broadcast from gigantic 360-foot steel towers that dotted the entire coast of England. They didn't even rotate. They just blasted a wide fan of radio energy out over the channel. But it worked. It could pick up groups of German bombers forming up over France, giving the RAF a crucial 20, 30, even 40 minutes of warning. Did the Germans know about it? Of course they did. Their own scientists, including brilliant men like Rudolf Hess, had warned the High Command about British advances in radio location. German intelligence had Zeppelin airships fly up and down the coast, listening to the signals. They correctly identified them as an early warning system. So what did the Luftwaffe under Hermann Göring do? They attacked the towers once or twice in August 1940. They did some minor damage, and then they stopped. Why? Because Göring, a man of profound technical ignorance and vanity, declared them to be of little importance. He and Hitler believed the spirit of the Luftwaffe pilots was all that mattered. They believed the brave RAF pilots would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They simply could not grasp the strategic power of what they were seeing. They didn't understand that Chain Home was more than just a detector. It was a system. The information from those radar towers was being fed into a central nerve center, the filter room at Fighter Command. There, women of the WAAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, moved wooden blocks representing enemy and friendly squadrons around a giant map table. This was the pre-decryption aid in action. It was a live, electronic, real-time picture of the entire battle. When the German bombers came over, they weren't met by a scattered, panicked defense. They were met by meticulously vectored squadrons of Spitfires climbing to the perfect altitude in the perfect position with the sun at their backs. The German pilots were baffled. They would report back that the RAF seemed to be invisible, that they appeared from nowhere. They weren't invisible. They were just informed. Hitler and Göring's dismissal of radar as a defensive gimmick cost them the Battle of Britain, and that loss, that failure to gain air superiority, made the invasion of England impossible. It was the first major turning point of the war in the West, and it was all because they didn't respect the electronic intel. This pattern continued. As the war progressed, the Allies didn't just have ground-based radar. They made it small. They made it light.
They put it in airplanes. American-built B-24 Liberator bombers equipped with new compact microwave radar could now patrol the Atlantic air gap, that patch of ocean too far from land for other planes to reach. Now, a U-boat surfacing in the middle of the night, in the middle of the ocean, was no longer safe. A Liberator, flying above the clouds, would see a tiny blip on its radar screen. The plane would dive down and at the last second flip on a terrifyingly powerful searchlight called the Lee light. For the U-boat crew on the conning tower, the world would suddenly turn from pitch black to blinding white, and seconds later, their world would end in a hail of depth charges. Once again, German intelligence knew about this. Their own scientists were working on radar. But Hitler's focus was elsewhere. He was demanding V-2 rockets to terrorize London. He was demanding jet fighters. He dismissed the small war of electronics. He didn't give his scientists the resources or the priority to develop effective countermeasures until it was far, far too late. His dismissal of this pre-decryption aid was, yet again, costing him dearly.
There was a third, even more subtle form of this intel. It's called traffic analysis. This is perhaps the most fascinating of all. Even if you cannot read a single word of an enemy's coded message, you can still learn an enormous amount just by watching who is talking to whom and when. Think of it this way. You're sitting in your living room, and you see 5 police cars with no sirens all drive down your quiet residential street and stop in front of your neighbor's house. You don't need to hear their radio traffic to know that something is happening at that specific house. That is traffic analysis. Allied listeners, part of the WWII service, would sit for hours listening to the squeal and static of German radio nets. They couldn't understand the Enigma coded messages, but they didn't always need to. They would log the call signs. They would note the frequencies. And they began to see patterns. For example, they learned that a specific U-boat, say call sign Alpha, was the designated convoy spotter for a certain wolfpack. When Alpha sent a signal, even a short one, they knew a convoy had been found. Then they would hear a flurry of signals from Donitz's headquarters at Lorient using the call signs for the other boats in that pack. And then they would hear those boats acknowledge the orders. The Allies might not know what the orders were, but they knew that a wolfpack had just been told to converge on a specific location. By combining this traffic analysis with a few Huff-Duff bearings, they could get a very, very good idea of where that wolfpack was forming. And the result? The Allied Convoy Command would simply reroute the convoy. They would send a signal to the convoy commodore, turn 40 degrees north for 10 hours. The merchant ships would turn, and the U-boat wolfpack arriving where the convoy should have been would find nothing but empty ocean. The Germans were, once again, baffled. They blamed bad luck. They blamed poor seamanship by their captains. They never blamed their own sloppy radio procedures. Why were they so sloppy? Again, it comes back to arrogance. They had such profound, unshakable faith in their Enigma machine that they believed it made them invincible. They believed that as long as the content of the message was secure, nothing else mattered. They didn't bother to change call signs frequently enough. They used predictable frequencies. They followed routine procedures. They were, in short, creatures of habit. And in the world of signals intelligence, habit is death. This combination, Huff-Duff, finding the U-boats, radar-equipped planes hunting them, and traffic analysis routing convoys around them, was the three-pronged spear that broke the U-boat arm. And all 3 of these methods were pre-decryption aids. They all worked before or alongside the breaking of Enigma. It's fascinating how these small, unglamorous details, a blip on a screen, a radio whisper, changed the world. Many of you watching have stories from your own service, perhaps from the Cold War or Vietnam, about intel. We'd be honored if you shared some of those non-classified memories in the comments.
It's a way for all of us to learn from your experience, and it helps everyone here understand just how important this unseen work truly is. So let's bring all these threads together. Let's go back to the central problem. We have Huff-Duff, we have radar, we have traffic analysis. In all three cases, these electronic aids were giving the Allies a game-changing, war-winning advantage. In all three cases, German intelligence officers, scientists, and even frontline commanders knew something was wrong and filed reports. And in all three cases, those reports were ignored, dismissed, or downplayed by the highest levels of command, right up to Hitler himself. This dismissal wasn't a single event. It wasn't one bad decision on one Tuesday. It was a culture. It was a systemic rot of arrogance that had set in. It was a culture that valued intuition and willpower over data and evidence. Hitler genuinely believed that his will, his fanaticism, could overcome material shortages or enemy technical advantages. It was a culture that was terrified of bringing the Führer bad news. A general who told Hitler his plan was flawed was likely to be screamed at, demoted, or worse. A general who told Hitler his plan was brilliant, even if it was failing, would be praised. This created a system where bad news simply stopped traveling uphill. It was filtered out by ambitious, terrified subordinates like Goering or Donitz, who didn't want to be the ones to tell Hitler that the British and Americans were electronically outsmarting them.
And finally, it was a culture obsessed with offensive miracle weapons, what they called Wunderwaffen, the V-2 rocket, the jet fighter, the Maus supertank. These were things Hitler could see. They were impressive. They fed his ego. A better radio receiver? A passive listening device? A more secure set of call signs? This was boring, defensive, defeatist thinking. He didn't care. His dismissal of US and British electronic intel was therefore not an oversight. It was a direct, logical consequence of his entire worldview. What if he hadn't dismissed it? It's a sobering thought. What if, in early 1942, Donitz had listened to his Bedienst, accepted the threat, and ordered all U-boats to maintain strict radio silence, only transmitting in dire emergencies? The wolfpack strategy would have collapsed, yes, but the U-boats would have survived. They would have had to hunt alone, as they did in World War I. The Allied escorts without the Huff-Duff bearings would have been blind again. The sinkings would not have stopped. The Battle of the Atlantic would have been prolonged, perhaps for another year, perhaps two. And what would that have meant? A Britain starved of fuel, of food, of American supplies? A Britain unable to serve as the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Allied bombing campaign? And the D-Day landings? The massive buildup of men and material in England that was necessary for Operation Overlord, it would have been impossible. The entire shape of the war in Europe would have changed. That is the stake. That is what was on the line. But he did dismiss it. The Americans and the British were exploiting a flaw not in the steel of the U-boats or the mechanics of the Enigma, but in the psychology of the Nazi leadership. This is the ultimate lesson of electronic warfare, one that is more relevant today than it ever was. It's not just about who has the best microchip or the fastest satellite. It's about the leaders who are willing to listen to the unglamorous, inconvenient truth that that technology provides. Hitler, surrounded by yes-men, blinded by his own sense of infallibility, was deaf to the electronic chorus that was shouting his U-boats' locations across the entire Atlantic. His intuition, which he believed was his greatest gift, had become his fatal weakness. So when we remember the heroes of Bletchley Park, and they were, absolutely, heroes, we must also remember the other heroes, the men and women, often forgotten, who sat in cold, dark rooms on land or in rocking, seasick compartments on destroyers, staring at a small green screen. We must remember the WAAF operators moving wooden blocks on a map, and the Y service listeners logging signals through the static. They weren't codebreakers, but they were reading the enemy's mind all the same.
They were using simple, practical electronic aids that the enemy knew existed, but simply refused to respect. Hitler's dismissal of this pre-decryption US and British intel was not just a mistake in a long list of them. It was arguably the fundamental, catastrophic mistake that made the Allied victory in the West and the eventual liberation of Europe possible. The story of the Second World War is filled with these hidden turning points, these small hinges on which the great doors of history swing. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a story that is rarely told, please consider sharing this video with a friend, or perhaps in a history group or a VFW hall with others who you know appreciate this kind of detail. It is truly the best way to help our channel grow and allow us to keep making more content just like this. We know this was a very long and detailed journey, and it's a lot of information to take in at once. Don't worry about remembering all the German names or the specific dates. What matters is the powerful and timeless lesson that arrogance is a blindfold, that believing your own propaganda is the surest way to defeat, that sometimes the most important warnings come not in a clear message, but in the faint static between the words. We've prepared another video, which you should see on your screen now, about the V2 rocket program. It's another perfect example of this same exact problem: Hitler's obsession with wonder weapons and his dismissal of practical reality. Thank you for spending your valuable time with us today. We'll see you on the next